Truth. I'm your host, Plain, and each week we go into a mystery or an anomaly out there in the world around us. And this week we're going to talk about radiation as policy. What's going on at Fukushima? Joining me will be Disaster Cat and special guests Doc Toops and Helium Avid. Is everyone there? Disaster Cat, you there?
I'm here.
I'm here, Plain.
Doc, Helium?
And Helium Avid, I'm here.
Let's get going then. So I guess we'll start by asking, we'll talk about Fukushima, which happened on 3/11 of 11. So it's been 2.5 years now, and maybe we have a little bit of a better idea of what actually happened. So I think we'd start by asking, do we really have an idea of what went down? What happened? Any ideas? Doc, what do you think?
Well, I think you had, I think the basic outline of the disaster is well known. You had a massive earthquake, which generated a massive tsunami, both of which, both singly and in conjunction with each other, resulted in the failure of at least 3 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence that indicates that reactor number 1 was fatally compromised by the earthquake itself before the tsunami ever struck, and that the other 2 were fatally compromised by the floodwaters themselves. Now, subsequently, as we all know, we had meltdowns, and then those morphed into melt-throughs where the containment structures were compromised, and now we have a massive global mess that is thus far uncontrolled, uncontrollable, and is polluting the Northern Hemisphere. I think that's the concise version.
Absolutely, and particularly they were precipitated by hydrogen explosions in the containments, actually destroying the integrity of the fuel bundles inside of the actual containments and driving perhaps fuel bundles down into the total disarray and leaving them so that they could not be cooled, leading to a Corium type event which melted down through the bottoms of several of the reactors.
Is it realistic to say that there's more than one Corium that's now kind of just doing its thing, melting down through the Earth?
I believe that to be the case. I think it's virtually unquestionable that the 3 reactors at issue have melted through.
Okay.
I agree with Doc. I think that there are 3 of them, and they've the only thing that's kept them from doing what in a normal China syndrome thing is where the Corium hits the cold water and then spews back up with a big steam thing is it's happened in slow motion, and it's been able to heat the water as it goes down slow enough into it and raise the temperature of the water table near the Corium such that it has a thermal gradient around it. And we've seen puffs of steam come out, but we haven't seen this shock wave as it was envisioned in the traditional China syndrome where the Corium dropped immediately into the cold water table and fractured. Instead, we've actually seen the water rise in temperature and heat up, and so it becomes almost like a little steam boiling water reactor around the Coriums, and it's creating tremendous amounts of radioactive water which they can't disperse with, and that's what seems to have led to a change from a level 1 to a level 3 radiological event at the plant today. This is what I heard today, because they can't dispose of the water that's cooling the Coriums. So it's a very, very bad situation.
Now, do you think that the coriums are down under the ground far enough that they are essentially leaking out into the ocean underground?
Doc,
I
go ahead.
believe that to be the case. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the continual flow of contaminated water into the ocean. You can't fight gravity, and it's my understanding that the dynamic we're currently witnessing is the groundwater traveling from the higher elevations immediately behind the plant down via the force of gravity under the plant where it is contaminated and then into the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your understanding, Helium?
Absolutely, and I think that what's happening is they're running out of the freshwater aquifer is being depleted with the amount of the corium is going to boil its way through that, and then there's going to be a seawater. And Doc, help me on this one because I'm not quite sure where the seawater dam pushes up the fresh water and where that actually makes its junction, where the corium is going to actually reach into the salt water from the fresh water.
Well, we have two variables here, both of which are fluctuating and one of which is unknown. In point of fact, no one knows exactly where the corium is situated. Everyone rightfully assumes that they are sitting below the reactors, but no one to date has been able to identify the exact depth. The other variable is the freshwater seawater interface near the shore. Now that's going to change with the hydraulic pressure of the groundwater going down to the beach, and it's going to change daily with the tidal shifts. So it should fluctuate marginally back and forth. But as we discussed before, Helium, there's an old survival technique that if someone is stranded on a beach that is abutted by cliffs or hills, and you need fresh water, you dig into the beach sand a few feet above the high tide level. And very shortly, you will come up with fresh, or at least drinkably fresh water. And that is because of that interface between the fresh aquifer water and the seawater. And the gravity at the higher elevations is constantly pressing that fresh water down into the ocean. And of course, that's what we see happening under Fukushima as we speak.
Right. And that's going to create a problem in that there will never be a static condition as long as the tides and the fresh water comes from the hills. There will always be water flowing through the corium, the areas where the corium are in. So it's always going to be flushing radionucleotides out into the sea through this area until either somehow it's sealed, or if, as Doc and I were talking, the actual coriums need to be plucked out of the puscules, if you will, and removed from that. So it's a very dangerous situation because you can't seal the reactor cores like you could in Chernobyl, where they built a sarcophagus. I can't say
Sarcophagus.
that word. Thank you. Over the top and leave it alone because of this huge water flow that's coming from the mountains and from the sea tides, pushing this radioactive mess out to the ocean underneath the plant. And so it's unimaginable the amount of radioactive trash which is going to be put into the sea unless some major steps are taken to stop this problem?
I'd
Well,
also like to. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, can we step back? I got a question. We know that there's now amazing satellite imaging available. I mean, it's used for mining, it's used for all kinds of things. And clearly, it's even used for the Nuclear Intelligence Division, the Z Division. So, I mean, how come we don't get anything at all with Fukushima? I mean, how deep can they be? I mean, they're not hundreds of feet, are they?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, we've almost never, by we, I mean the public, has almost never gotten anything from the intelligence agency. So this is just par for the course. I'm personally convinced that within hours of the event, all of the major powers had a very good handle on what exactly was going down. The technology ranging from satellite imagery to atmosphere sniffing planes has been around to discover that since the late 50s and early 60s. There's nothing new there. The Russians can do that, the Chinese can easily do it, and of course the United States can do it. It's just a matter of having that intelligence shared with the public, which it never is.
Well, I mean, but here's an example, Doc. After 9/11, at some point, I forget, I think it was NASA released it, but there was imaging, thermographic imaging of the area around the trade centers.
Right.
And you could see massive heat days later. I forget the numbers now, but 1,500 degrees or whatever underground at different places there. And that was released to the public. And presumably the threat was kind of, what would we say, minimal? I mean, you weren't supposed to enter that area anyway, right? So here we have a situation that's been going on 2.5 years, and we, as far as I know, have seen almost nothing.
Well, then that's obviously by policy, isn't it?
Yeah, of course it is. Yes. It's a different topic, but I think I've heard from different sources that they were spraying a lot of boron materials at 9/11, but that's another topic as to what was going on there.
Well, they did that at Chernobyl, and I understand they've done that at Fukushima as well. That's a very standard procedure because it serves as a neutron absorber.
Of course, but that means the point is that 9/11, they had some reason for absorbing neutrons. But that's a different topic.
That's a different topic, yes.
That we can avoid entirely for now. But I would just say it is worth considering because that massive heat stayed there for, whatever, over a month or something. And if you come from a background in something like chemistry or chemical engineering, you don't maintain heat very long. It takes special materials to do that. But anyway, so the point, though, is with Fukushima, we've got almost no, what can I say, outside information about temperatures or depth of coriums, right?
Correct.
And they should be able to split those off. Actually, they have cameras with sufficient resolution to actually separate the cores. So I'm surprised they haven't shown anything except that, as Doc points out, the Japanese have not asked for any help, and even today is the only time they've begun to ask for help. And there may be some reasons why they've not asked for help. There may be some reasons why the international community has not offered any help, and do with what was in those cores, what's in the reactor pools, and what is on site. And again, it's speculation. Is there more plutonium there than is expected? Is there more?
Well, I'll speculate because that's part of the purpose of the show. I would say that Fukushima is where they had one of the places they had their nuclear program in World War II. There's uranium in Fukushima, that area, naturally. And I don't think it's totally unknown that that was where they were doing a lot of work. They were also doing it in Nagoya and what's today North Korea, because that was part of the Japanese Empire at the time. But they had a top physicist in the world who was close with the German physicists, and he was quite aware of what they were working on in terms of their nuclear programs. So, I mean, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's got plutonium like a duck, And also, I just think realistically, if you were a Japanese policymaker, Helium, if you were a physicist advising the Japanese government, I mean, it's no secret that they want the ability to build nuclear weapons very quickly and be able to deliver them very quickly. It's basically their official policy, right?
Agreed.
So it's not even really wild conspiracy talk to just say that's their position. Their position is, if the world situation gets strange, if America has a financial collapse or China goes crazy or whatever, well, we want to be able to have deliverable nukes on missiles within, whatever, a short period of time, a month or two. And they're a high-tech country and they can do it. But they got to have the plutonium in a form and so on and so forth. And so I think clearly there's some element of that. I happened to talk to a French doctor who was in Tokyo a lot. He volunteered to go help people, but essentially they didn't want any help after the tsunami. And I think it's because they didn't want any help of any kind. They couldn't trust people. A French doctor could be working for French intelligence, the DGSE.
Agreed.
That kind of thing. And so if I were the Japanese government, I wouldn't have let a French doctor near Fukushima. No way. But it just raises the question of what they were doing there. And I think it's obvious they were doing more than just standard nuclear power.
Well, as I'm sure you realize, and again, I don't think this is an international secret, at least not amongst the various intelligence agencies, but by analyzing the isotope content of the emissions from the cores, they would know whether or not there was too much plutonium in that inventory to be represented by purely power production. Because if they're looking for weapons material, they'll leave those rods in for a longer period than would be economic for purely power production purposes. And that would show up in the isotope signature.
True. But I think that's one of the reasons why you had such a bad response by the Japanese government or Tokyo Electric. I think they didn't know what to do because there were two high-level goals and they didn't necessarily agree with one another. One was they wanted to cover everything up, and the other is that they kind of needed to not let it get out of hand. And, right, to cover it up, you can't let foreign advisors in, right? Arriva or American military. Anyway, if you can't control them, you don't want them going there. So I think that's one of the reasons they had such a bad response. Would you agree with that?
Definitely agree with that.
It sounds perfectly reasonable to me.
Yeah. Actually, why don't we get into the response? What do you think of the response? Helium, any thoughts on it?
I think it is absolutely ridiculous, particularly once they realized that they had lost control of the power during shutdown because of the tsunami, and that their backup generators were up on the fourth floor, and the fourth floor was not going to save them from the tsunami wave. And once after they had the hydrogen explosions, they should have realized they were really in bad shape, and they didn't. And I think it's, Doc and I have sort of talked about this, and the Japanese have a very good culture in that they believe if they can't solve it, nobody else can. And I've visited many Japanese plants. I've visited many Japanese labs, and believe me, I tend to agree with them. If they can't fix it, nobody else can. Their technology level is superior to almost anyone else in the world. And they.
Well, helium, I've been in Japanese factories
Yep.
where I don't know how to put it, but the standards were like 2 orders of magnitude better than American factories
Agreed.
for cleanliness and such.
Well, even for
Now
technology.
they weren't nuclear, but other like high tech materials, and so I'm sure they have what can we say, a certain amount of, I don't know if you want to call it arrogance, but a certain attitude that is not unjustified. However, that would explain, let's say, what you're seeing going to a nuclear facility. But as a practical matter on the ground in Japan, the response with the citizens, so let's talk about farmers or food or children or other things, the response has been rather poor.
Well, Plain, if I may, I've given this a great deal of thought, and I think the easiest way to address the TEPCO and government response to Fukushima is to compare it with Chernobyl. I don't know how many of your listeners remember the 1986 Chernobyl explosion, but when that reactor exploded, the then Soviet authorities undertook a massive remediation program. They impressed over 500,000 so-called liquidators. There are still many square miles of hopelessly contaminated aircraft and vehicles that were used in the effort. And through a Herculean effort, they managed to mostly, and that's a key word, mostly contain Chernobyl. You didn't see any corresponding action on the part of the Japanese authorities. And I can only explain that by believing that the Japanese authorities immediately or almost immediately understood that any such effort would be futile. They realized it was a hopeless cause virtually from day one.
Well, there's hopeless and then there's hopeless. I mean, why not save the children? I mean, the country's incredibly rich. They can put them in a disaster facility 100 miles away instead of 10 miles away, that kind of thing.
Oh, I agree with you absolutely regarding the civilian protection angle. I'm referring strictly to efforts to contain
the plant itself.
At Fukushima, correct.
Got it. Okay. Well, what do you think, Helium?
Well, one of the things I really did see is that the plant radiation footprint was not anything as expected. It was not this traditional round circle, but it was instead a very much eye-shaped pattern facing from the hills to the sea, and it was very high concentration in there. And as you went out on either side, it was dropped off very precipitously. And I think that the radiation health safety officers saw this in their original data, and they said, we don't have to, and then the politicians asked them, do we have to? And they said, no, we don't have to. We see that the radiation is not that bad outside of these, it's not a circular pattern. And so I've seen pictures where along that path it's been decimated, but they didn't have to, so they didn't. And so I think that's what happened in Japan. And so they didn't.
Well, I think there are a lot of things to consider here. I mean, one is different people are getting different lies, right? So the question is, what actually did go down? In Tokyo proper, many people had a metallic taste in their mouths. And so when they initially came out and said, the fallout or whatever didn't come to Tokyo, it's like, okay, but then why have so many people got a metallic taste? right?
Well, I might add that it seems that Tokyo is far more significantly contaminated than the authorities have acknowledged.
Agreed.
That would be my assumption, yes.
But again, we're talking about the difference between a few millirem, tens of millirem versus rads. And so they were talking about, again, keeping people versus in rads versus millirem. And I think everybody was declared as a radiation worker and could be exposed to millirem type doses. And everybody in Japan just got elevated to being radiation workers. And that happened to all the people in Tokyo. And
Yes. I mean, I don't know what level you start to have a metallic taste and how serious that is, but it doesn't sound like a good thing.
No.
Well, as you may know, a metallic taste in your mouth is one of the signatures consistently with reactor meltdowns. In virtually every reactor meltdown, people in the affected area experience that metallic taste.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got a story for you. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the prime minister at the time, Prime Minister Khan, had a physics background. I think he had an undergraduate degree in physics or maybe a master's. And like most technical people, he liked technical things, right? And he was doing calculations about how bad it could be. And his aide, or one of his aides, like in charge of, scientific policy or something, got a chance to talk to I don't know if it was the head of Tokyo Electric or the head of their nuclear division or something. And the guy essentially said to him, don't ask questions, but worst case is essentially it blows up to the edge of Tokyo. And so this guy went to the prime minister and said, look, this is what they're telling me. They're saying it's that bad. And the prime minister said, well, I'm going to calculate everything. Because again, I think he had like a master's degree in physics and he's happy with doing calculations. And he says, no way. It can't, remotely be that close. And so the advisor gets back and has a hard time reaching the guy again, but finally he does. And the guy says, look, I told you, don't ask questions. Okay. It's that bad if it's a worst case. And you can find this on YouTube, but I don't think there's going to be any English, subtitles or anything. And they may have taken this video down by now. But the implication I get from that is that they had, a lot more material that could explode than they're claiming.
Well, the problem is that we have a lot more material there that may be able to spread around. And it's nice that we can all talk about this, but the poor people who live in Japan are on the precipice. And I don't see a good outcome at all for the people that are living in Japan with what is occurring at Fukushima right now. I see nothing but sorrow.
Well,
I would take that a step further, Plain, and I discussed this with Helium probably going back 2 years, as well as with other people with similar interests. And I said that ultimately, and I still believe this today, I said that ultimately, I think Tokyo will become the world's largest slum. It will be a very nice slum. It won't be a dangerous, run-down slum like Detroit, but eventually northern Japan, in very slow motion, will become effectively uninhabitable. That doesn't mean that people will step outside and keel over dead from acute radiation poisoning. What I mean by that is that over time, the isotope burdens, the contamination will become so great that disease rates will continue to rise and no one will want to live there. So you'll start to see the international money trickle and then flood out of Tokyo and northern Japan. And as the moneyed interests leave, you'll be left with the lower middle class and impoverished residents who can't afford to go anywhere else, and the healthcare costs will start to skyrocket.
Agreed.
Well, that raises a few other questions, though. I mean, one is, don't the wind patterns typically blow it over to places like Seattle?
Correct.
But it's a long distance across there, and the wind patterns tend to buffet against the Seattle area, and then they bounce off and they tend to head back out in the sea. So you get, a couple orders of magnitude lost across the ocean. You lose another order of magnitude when you bump up against it, and you lose more as you settle out in the ocean. So Seattle is not anywhere near in the danger zone that Tokyo is. Tokyo's gets heavy duty stuff that rises up into the atmosphere, and heavy duty particulates, strontium, cesium, things like that, which can drop out of the atmosphere close in, and it's like fallout. You can some of the fallout from some of the nuclear tests done out in the Pacific, where the fallout fell onto the boats and things like this.
Bikini and stuff. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's going to be what's going to be falling on Tokyo. That's not going to fall on. It'll fall out of the atmosphere before it gets to Seattle. But
I wish I had your confidence in this. My experience, and then the people I follow in the kind of like the nuclear world, so to speak, not nuclear physicists, but I mean people concerned about things, is that the northern part of the United States, there have been a lot, particularly people who got stuck in rain, very serious, incidents, people, having their teeth fall out and things like that, bleeding from different places and stuff.
I've been monitoring that here.
And I mean, I just have a personal experience. I went to Vancouver and with my wife, and both of us, it was like maybe 2 Junes ago or something. I don't know, but it rained almost every day. And I got stuck in the rain once, and that day too, both my wife and I had essentially heart pains, which we don't have. So that's not proof of anything, but on the other hand, and also the body just kind of felt funky.
Well, that's why you need to have a nuke alert.
Well, I have a Geiger counter, but I mean, you're not going to carry it when you're walking around on a trip, necessarily.
Well,
the answer is to stay out of the rain. I'm sorry?
No, that's why the fob, the little silly tool, which is not any good for anything else but to alert you to the problems of being caught out in the rain. That nuke alert is a good device to let you know. Good, go, no go is a very nice device to have, and it's not an advertisement. I get nothing for it, but the nuke alert, it's on your keychain, and if you think you're in a place where you're getting bombarded, it'll tell you. So
I have to disagree slightly, Helium. Only I like the nuke alert. I think it is a worthwhile device to own, and I endorse it. However, in North America, with respect to Fukushima radiation, we're talking about very low levels. And the nuke alert, let me finish. The nuke alert, only detects gamma, and it only begins to alarm at 100 milliroentgen per hour, which is far too high to detect Fukushima fallout that's been hitting us.
Well, Plain was talking about teeth falling out and things like that. And so.
Oh, but that was after. That was like 10 days after. I mean, for example, I mean, there's a well-known internet personality for talking about nuclear stuff, Rad Chick, if you know who she is. Doc, you may have heard of her. Well, I mean, someone in her family have worked in nuclear plants, but she's from a medical background. But she essentially had to be outside, before moving with a yard sale. And it was whatever, a week or 10 days after Fukushima happened. And so she asked her brother, who works in nuclear plants, or maybe it was her cousin, I don't remember, but, do you think it's safe? And it's like, oh, yeah, it's no problem. No, don't worry, we're fine. We're over here. And she and her family were outside, and as luck would have it, it rained pretty hard on them while they're out there trying to sell stuff to get ready to move. And, well, it was pretty grim, because then you start getting and not just her, I mean her kids and whatever, bleeding from orifices, losing teeth, things like that. And so I think, but that was again in the initial period. I'm not talking about today. I'm saying, whatever it was, 10 days after the event or something like that.
I'd like to share some of my personal experiences, because I'm in the extreme southern United States, but I have very sensitive Geiger counters. And I discussed this with Helium at the time. He was a bit, I believe, reticent to believe my results, but I've been doing wipe tests after rainstorms. And a wipe test is simply where you take an absorbent material and wipe down usually a square meter area and then measure that. And I've gotten some incredibly high readings, not so much lately, though I do get often higher readings after rainstorms. But shortly after the event, I had very substantial readings. And for instance, the normal background here at my location would be about 32 counts per minute. And doing the wipe tests after some of the rain out, I would get counts up into the hundreds of counts per minute. And I mean, to illustrate the difference for that, if you think your listeners would be interested, yeah. I can give you an audio.
Let's do that, Doc. Let's do that, Doc.
Okay.
Well, I've got another angle on this.
Oh, here, just a second. We're going to do a little demonstration here.
Now, what you're going to hear now is the occasional click of my normal background radiation right here in front of my computer. Can you hear those clicks? They're intermittent.
Yes.
Okay, those come in at about 32 counts per minute. That's my baseline average. After some of the rain out, doing my wipe tests, I would get counts that sound like this. Can you hear the difference?
Sure.
And that's about 500 counts per minute. I simulated that with a piece of uranium glass out of my collection. But I've heard, especially in Canada and Seattle, there have been many reports on the internet of people getting counts like that in just normal rainstorms. And that's very significant. Again, it's
well,
not
that's what I was getting with my Geiger counter.
It's not getting that radiation sickness levels, but it is of concern from a health perspective.
Well, I certainly got that in Portland, Oregon.
And by and large, we would expect more northern areas like Oregon to have, and especially areas west of the mountains, to have more elevated counts than we would pick up here in the Deep South.
Well, okay, now here's another issue, I think, which is that these, you also have to look at the response of the government or corporations. What have they done? And I would say it looks like it's a lot harder to get food tested now. For radiation.
Well, you know that the EPA shut down quite a few of their radiation monitoring stations.
Quite a few?
And that was done
like almost all of them, right?
Right. So yeah. I have my own conspiracy theories regarding that. I'm sure you're aware, if you follow the economic news, that the Western financial system has been hanging on by its fingernails for years now. Well, you have three major financial capitals, three Western financial capitals in the world, and those are in no particular order of importance: London, New York, and Tokyo. And Japan forms an integral part of the Western financial system. So if you look at not only the radiological implications, but the financial implications of the whole truth about Fukushima being known, I think that's part and parcel of the cover-up. I think the powers that be are very much aware of the financial implications.
Oh, I agree, for sure. I think that that actually is the issue, is that Tokyo is like the most important financial city on earth in many ways. I mean, the real estate value is, you know, perhaps, whatever, worth way more than Canada or something like that. It's an incredible thing. And if the banks go down in Tokyo, the banks will go down in most of the Western world.
I'm sure you're familiar with Arnie Gunderson from Fairwinds.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, Gunderson was in Tokyo, I think it was 6 or 8 months ago, and took random soil samples from open green spaces. Now, he was very careful not to take samples from places where you would expect the highest accumulations, such as gutter drain tiles and such. He would just walk into public parks, public walkways, and scoop up small samples of soil. He sent those back to the United States, properly declared them through customs, and sent them off to a certified lab. And they all came back as being hot enough to qualify as nuclear waste, which required special disposal in Texas.
And Texas is a very, they do have very special needs as far as nuclear waste disposal.
Why is that?
I can say I'm a Texas radiation safety officer. I can say that Texas takes its radiation safety very seriously.
Okay.
Well,
I know.
Helium, I don't want to be misunderstood. He didn't send the samples back to Texas. He sent the samples back to his business, and they came back as being so hot that they needed to be disposed of as radioactive waste and sent to a facility in Texas. Little distinction there. But
well,
that
I'm
was
familiar with
normal ground soil in Tokyo.
Oh yeah, that's definitely the case. It's all over. I was going to point out, though, that I think that a lot of food in the U.S. is now much higher than you're being told, particularly things that accumulate, like, let's say, cheese or something. There are very few places left where you can test food, I'm told. And, it costs $1,000 or whatever, so not too many people are willing to do it. But there is the POTR blog in Missouri where they've sent off, I don't know, maybe a dozen things, beef and cheese. And they also do after a rainstorm, they, wipe down their cars or whatever. And I would say that even as recently as, a month ago or something, or a few months ago, they were getting very bad numbers, as I would define it. Anything over 1,000 becquerels per kilogram, I don't think you want in your food.
Right.
I agree. It's difficult to test food because some of the most dangerous emitters, such as the alpha particle emitters, are effectively self-shielded by the food, as are a lot of the low-energy beta emitters.
Yes, that's actually another question maybe our listeners would like to hear, and that is, we hear that there are dozens of different kinds of radiation. So if you buy a Geiger counter, how many do you actually end up testing? How many can you find?
Helium, do you want me to take that, or do you want to take that?
Well, you're probably better on all the different wonderful types of Geiger counters. You have a whole array of them. But I say, if you can, you have a thin window detector, you can count it in your food. You probably want to be talking to somebody more reliable than yourself, because it is a very complex equation. But for the short answer, that's a short answer. Go ahead and give the long answer, Doc.
Okay. There are three basic types of radiation the consumers will want to be aware of. That's gamma, beta, and alpha. The alphas are the least penetrating, but potentially the most dangerous. The betas fit in between, and the gamma is very similar to, but more energetic than X-rays. And they are the easiest to detect. The problem with the alpha emitters, they are, depending on the literature, depending on who you want to believe, the alpha emitters are 20 to 100 times more damaging than the gamma. though some literature claims they're 1,000 times more dangerous. And frankly, I don't know. The problem is that they are stopped by as little as a layer of thin water, a droplet of water, or a sheet of paper. So once they wind up in your body, it's virtually impossible to detect them externally. So in other words, let's say you want to buy a fish. You go to the fish market and you have a very sensitive pancake tube Geiger counter. Well, you scan the fish and the fish seems to be okay. You're not getting elevated counts, but that's really not giving you a clue as to what alpha emitters might be inside the flesh of the fish. Now, it's better than not testing them at all, but it's not a comprehensive or complete test of your food. That makes sense, Helium?
Yep. And the actual thing is with the alpha emitters is they can be wonderful in as far as prostate cancer as a treatment for that, but that's because it can be very localized and a very good treatment for that. But again, that's because it is very localized and not, again, with the gammas and things like that, you get a whole body experience with the gammas. With the alphas, you get very, very localized treatment.
The difference between alpha exposures once they're captured by a cell and gamma tends to be analogous to being illuminated by a floodlight or outdoors illuminated by the sun, as opposed to being hit with a pinpoint laser. So the problem with an alpha is that if you ingest this, an alpha emitter, if you ingest it and it lodges in a cell, it intensely irradiates the surrounding cell tissue and can initiate a cancer.
Absolutely. Or cure a cancer. As in prostate cancer.
Or cure a cancer, sure, if it's being administered medically to a specific area as opposed to randomly being ingested and lodging in lung tissue, muscle tissue, or tissue or bone tissue.
Right.
Okay, what about on your end? What have you done differently since Fukushima, if anything? Helium?
I've looked towards getting my son's potential next wife out of Japan, to be honest.
Okay, well, that's a real honest thing. What about in terms of diet, travel, anything like that?
No, I haven't traveled Japan for a good 20 years. I spent a lot of time in Japan back 25 years ago. I haven't traveled Japan for a while. But
but do you use an N95 mask when you fly, for example?
No, I don't. I don't foresee that as being really useful because it doesn't give me enough coverage around my face because I have facial hair, things like that. I need to go with a real 3M painter's mask type of thing if I'm going to be using that for self-protection. The N95 mask is good, but it's just not sufficient for my particular face size. So I don't have that real soft feature that the mask needs. But I was brought up working on mercury diffusion pumps and cleaning them out, and lithium ion canals and all sorts of things where if I was worried about those sort of things, I wouldn't have my degrees that I do. But I think that the thing which bothers me the most about Fukushima is that they've let it go on too long. And the corium has solidified to the point where in my opinion, all of the superstructure is going to have to be removed and moved away from the above the top of the cores, and the pits are going to have to be pulled out of the water and brought up and put in casks, dry casks above them, and because otherwise the tremendous amount of water that's going to be needed to cool that is going to be continue to be contaminated. And people, I've been reading on a number of different websites, things like that, where people say, well, all it is, the cores are just was originally in the mantle, and we just put them up there, and it's not a big problem. Well, the big problem is that it's neutron activation analysis. The coriums are all. I didn't hear you. Go ahead. Did I lose you?
I didn't say anything. You want to just go back?
Yeah, just go ahead. Yeah, it's like it's neutron activation analysis, where the corium is still super critical, and it's creating a whole bunch of neutrons. Those neutrons create other isotopes, and so it's almost like a breeder reactor in some ways, not actually breeding up plutonium, but it's breeding up the other things. One of the books I'd like to recommend gives you sort of some idea of what the problem is. It's not really all of the ideas. It's a book called We Almost Lost Detroit by John G. Fuller. And I was going to get you the, it was distributed by John Crowell and Company in 1973. And the ISBN number is 0-88349-070-6. And it gives you a whole lot of insight into some of the early reactor accidents of the 20th century. And, it's I won't say it's a it's an exciting book, let's just say that. But it does cover a number of the really bad accidents that we did have in the first part of the century. So,
Doc, what about you? Are there any things that you're doing in terms of food, diet, travel, etc.?
There are only two measures that we've undertaken in this household. One is we've bought a single standalone whole house air filter. And the other thing we do is try to avoid being outside in the rain. Now, with that air filter, over time, I do detect elevated counts on the filter matrix. It's not as significant now as it was in the first year after the accident, but it's still notable.
What about all the food from the California Valley? Do you think that's not a problem?
I think it is a long-term problem. I think at this point it is a minor problem, but it's destined to become more severe over time. Part of the problem with isolating your foodstuffs is that there's all too often no reliable way to know where what the origin of the food is. If you go into most supermarkets, for instance, and you buy bulk tomatoes or other produce off the shelf, it's not marked with its origin, whether it comes from California or Mexico or whether it's locally produced. And I've had some people say, well, go to your local farmer's market. That's not always a solution either, because all too often the farmers buy bulk produce from jobbers, and it's not coming out of the local farms in any case.
And I've been monitoring my local produce come from the farmers markets, and I've not detected any increase in radiation in any of that food coming from at least local San Jose food markets.
The problem, Plain, is that we have this unfortunate dynamic not only in the United States, but worldwide, where people are pigeonholed into either being identified as pro-nuke or anti-nuke. And I think that's the wrong dynamic, and we have to look at the problem with completely different eyes nowadays. You know, for instance, I'm an avid recreational shooter. I'm a firearms enthusiast. However, I deplore the irresponsible use of firearms. Now, does that make me, quote unquote, anti-gun or pro-gun? Well, I think it makes me a proponent of the right use of the right tool at the right time, and an opponent of the irresponsible use of any tool at the wrong time. And that's kind of how we have to look at nuclear energy, in my view. It's not a matter of being pro-nuke or anti-nuke. You know, there are countless people who've been cured by nuclear medicine. There are all kind of advantages to nuclear power. And nuclear reactors, much as I hate to say it, there's a lot of good that comes out of these things, but equally, we're not masters of the technology. There have been too many what you can only describe as irresponsible accidents. If if I may, I don't wish to be too long-winded here, but I'd like to further address the concept of responsibility. Can I do that?
Okay. What do you got to say?
Well, you know, when Chernobyl happened, we in the West, and I include Japan, I include the Western Alliance nations, we all condemned the Soviets, and rightfully so, for their culture of secrecy and the fact that they didn't warn their population and they didn't evacuate their people until days after the event. But if you look at what we've done in the West, it's the same damn thing. We had Britain's Windscale reactor fire in 1957. The thing was burning uncontrollably. The authorities didn't notify anyone. They didn't evacuate anyone. And the countryside was blanketed with the residue of burning uranium and plutonium fuel. As Helium said, Fermi 1, the breeder reactor, it melted down in 1966. The authorities didn't warn anyone. They didn't tell anyone to evacuate, and some radiation was spread across the countryside. Same thing happened a decade later at 3 Mile Island. The reactor operators were sitting on top of a completely out-of-control reactor. They had no way of mitigating it. Only by the grace of God and incredibly good luck did that reactor remain intact. They didn't warn anyone. No evacuation orders were issued. The operative thinking was not to alarm the public. Well, of course you should alarm the public. It's a very alarming phenomena. And if anything would have slightly been different in that scenario, a lot of people would have been killed.
Well, I think, though, the people at the top don't care about collateral damage. I mean, they don't care if a few 100,000 people die. As a matter of fact, you're in the Gulf Coast area, aren't you? I mean,
Correct.
I mean, you can see there maybe it's in the interests of the oil companies or whoever to depopulate the area, so it's easier to drill the way they want.
That could well be. I followed the BP catastrophe. I relocated in large part because of the BP disaster.
So you can see they do what they want,
similar.
and they don't care if 100,000 people die. I mean, that's just collateral damage. Okay, so we also have a few questions from Disaster Cat about some of the issues from Fukushima. Disaster Cat, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm wondering, and this also relates back to Chernobyl as well as background. Over here in Europe, especially in Ireland, they have a program called the Children of Chernobyl, which was going on when we moved here about 18 years ago. And they would bring children over and teenagers that had been affected or had cancers or a lot of thyroid problems and just get them out of the area for the summer. But that program is still going on nearly 20 years later, and which tells me that there are probably not just children of Chernobyl, but probably grandchildren of Chernobyl. And if this keeps up, there's going to be great-grandchildren of Chernobyl. And I wonder if there's been any signs yet in Japan of this sort of damage And if so, what can we expect? And will it probably be worse or about the same, or does anybody know?
Well, I can tell you that there are reports now of increasing juvenile thyroid cancer cases occurring in the Fukushima area. And juvenile thyroid cancer is virtually unheard of.
Yeah, and I think the actual damage created in Japan is going to be far, an order of magnitude greater than Chernobyl, because the Russians moved people out rather expeditiously, and the Japanese government has left people in the hot zone, and so there's going to be many more people in the hot zone and going to be affected by the disaster.
Do either of you have a take on the Soviet work of Yablokov and Bondashevsky regarding how many may have died prematurely? I think the number was around 950,000 as they calculated it.
I've heard that number. Of course, the nuclear industry denies that anyone died other than the immediate casualties during the explosion and fire.
Well, they would. And I don't pretend to have any answer, but again, it should be pointed out, those numbers are, statistically speaking, people should be living to, 70 and they die at 64 or something like that, right? So those are statistical calculations. They're not really proven things.
Well, Plain, another problem, aside from the immediate damage and the immediate casualties, is the genetic damage that is done to the human race. You can have any number of people who show absolutely no signs of illness or disease, yet carry chromosomal damage that can be passed down to successive generations. And that's sort of like one of the hidden dangers in all of these nuclear disasters that receives very little press.
I had a roommate in college that was from her parents were survivors of Nagasaki, and the first interesting thing she said was that her parents had to marry each other because survivors could only marry survivors. But she said, now she herself looked just fine, but she was worried about having children because she said their family got off relatively lightly because her brother was born without an ear, but that was the only defects they had. But that in many of the other families that and again, it might have been exacerbated because survivor did marry a survivor, but there was a lot of reports and of children born with severe birth defects, much worse than just not having an ear. And that was like from a one-time bombing. And I think part of my question is, because the situation in Japan is ongoing, is it likely to be even worse than Chernobyl in the terms of long-term effects? Because it sounds to me like, from what you're saying, that this is not just an accident that happened. This is an ongoing accident that keeps on going.
Absolutely. It is very much an ongoing accident and continues to be an accident and is going to continue. It's the gift that just keeps on giving. And there's going to be, probably, knowing the Japanese, where they have you have your blood type known as much as cookie. They look at blood types. They're going to look at what your heritage is before they decide whether you're going to have intermarriage or not. And this is going to make some people non-marriageable because they're going to become from the Fukushima place of birth, and they're going to have a scarlet, I guess it would be a scarlet F on them.
Well, for sure, I think we're going to see that. Disaster Cap, my guess would be it's going to be at least 10 times worse than Chernobyl, but perhaps a lot more. But it does depend on how you calculate things. Ruining the North Pacific a little bit, that's a tremendous food source for the world.
Yeah, that was going to be my next kind of question or comment, was when we first moved to Europe in around 1994 1995, I believe it was, we went from England to Sweden. And at that time, this was less than 10 years after Chernobyl, and it was still considered unsafe to eat some of the reindeer meat from the Sami areas. So I don't know if they were just being overly careful or if they were actually testing, because the Swedes are fairly careful about those things. But there was still food contamination apparently going on, from, again, a one-time accident 9 or 10 years later, both in the a little bit in the plants, but particularly in the reindeer and the higher mammals that people that eat meat eat off the food chain. And I just wondered, again, because of the damage in the Pacific and stuff, just how widespread is this likely to get, and is it likely to affect more than even just the Pacific Ocean eventually, or does anybody even really know?
Well, Disaster Cat, I'd like to point out that there are still places in Germany where it is forbidden to eat the wild boar because of radiation contamination from Chernobyl. And you speak of Chernobyl in the past tense, but it's important to note that Chernobyl is not really over. That plant still leaks, though admittedly to a small degree. That plant still leaks isotope pollution on a daily basis.
And Doc, aren't they planning a new sarcophagus for that plant?
Yes, it's under construction because the old one began to, crumble and become structurally unsound. But
well, I've got a question that's going to get a little bit off here. I mean, it's not exactly a secret that the nuclear industry is really, what can we say? It's tied in with weapons. It's tied in with the highest levels of the military and the powers that be on Earth. And so we can't really be sure that they're telling us the truth about anything, right? So, for example, in Japan, I think it was in 2007, there were two earthquakes that were quite close. One of them was very close to what I think was the biggest nuclear plant on Earth from an electricity generating point of view, and that was in Niigata. And it was rumored that it was leaking somewhat, but it was just totally covered up. I mean, essentially no information anyone could find anywhere. Do either of you know anything about that?
No plane, I don't personally recall that incident, but with respect of leaking, everyone should understand that reactors always leak to one degree or another, usually a very small degree. But if we look at photographs of the Fukushima plant, you'll notice each one of those reactors had what appeared to be a smokestack, quite tall, adjacent to each reactor building. And that's not a smokestack. What that is designed to do is to channel the radioactive leakage from the reactor up into the higher levels of the atmosphere and disperse it. So it's not like any of these reactors are leak-proof. None of them are. They all produce radioactive leakage to one degree or another.
You just gave me extreme chills, because when we lived in Sweden, of course, Sweden has a lot of nuclear power plants, and one wasn't that far from where we lived. That was hard to be away from. And in the dead of winter, when it was bitterly, bitterly cold, and the atmosphere would get a certain way, I thought they were smokestacks until you just said that. And you could see the vapor or whatever, instead of going straight up, it would go like straight sideways or even be pushed nearly partway down. And it just gave me chills. Ugh.
Well, this one in Niigata might have, I mean, it was put out of commission. I don't know if you can say permanently, but it was a multi-billion-dollar hit on the Japanese economy. And as I said, there have been rumors over the years that essentially it cracked stuff that shouldn't be cracked or whatever. But I really have no way of knowing, because it's such, it's like trying to visit Area 51, essentially. They have a dog and pony show that a journalist or maybe a scientist can see, but it's all kind of classified as a practical matter, what they're really up to. And certainly Fukushima, because it had all this military application. But anyway, it gets into the more speculative topic of, okay, so Japan is like earthquake and tsunami ground zero, so to speak, right?
Well,
and
one of the questions I must admit I do not understand is that there exists for private personnel, citizens, to have things tested. Why are citizens totally reliant on the government to test these things? There are independent labs available which can test these things. Why are we so dependent on the government? And why are we believing the government when we could do these tests ourselves? I don't understand.
Well, the food test costs $1,000, more than that.
Exactly. It's
So, I
exclusion
mean,
by
so helium,
expense.
I mean, how many people can afford? I mean, the other problem, and you know this from different fields, is let's say you do a test. What does one test prove, right? So you buy some cheese from a local farmer in wherever you live, San Jose or northern Texas or whatever, and it comes up with some number. But you don't know if that's just because lately it's been raining a lot, or is it always that way, or what's good or bad. I mean, it doesn't prove anything. You really need to do 100 tests from different locations and different kinds of food. Nobody's
Well,
got that kind of money.
well, I guess I don't see why we don't talk to the labs who have the uh, wherewithal to do these sort of analyses and get
But
on
helium,
their.
they're all under tremendous political pressure. I mean, the United States, you could argue.
No, they're not. They're not. I'd have to ask
Disagree?
them. I'd have to ask them if they do this, but I'm sure that.
Oh, well, wait a minute. Are we talking about food?
Well, probably not food, but probably swipes or something like that. Food is
Because
food.
because the only place I know, as I said, there is this blog called POTR, where they have spent many, many thousands of dollars, and different places 2 or 3 years ago would test food, but they started refusing. They got too much heat from the government or wherever, and there's only one left, they say, and they can't use the name of it. Now, it's possible that they're mistaken, but I've spent a lot of effort in trying to do this, and it sounds totally believable. And as an example, look at the ocean testing in the Pacific. There are all these universities and places like Woods Hole or whatever, all these different groups that must have some idea of what's going on with the sea life. But
Well,
I mean, aren't they? I mean, I don't think they're willing to give the numbers
no,
because they can lose their jobs.
no. Unless somebody submits a sample, they don't run the samples, and unless somebody submits a sample, they don't do it. And I guess I would be willing to see if Doc, you and I could work something out. We could see if.
I'd be glad to, Helium, but I'm not aware of any labs that will do that free
Oh,
or even at low
I do.
cost.
I am. I'd have to trade.
Well, then I would just challenge you, Helium. I think there are many, many reports of all kinds of things in the Pacific, along the coast, down to San Diego, but certainly up in the Washington area or whatever, where you have seals and various other things seeming to die of radiation poisoning, or getting sick from it and then starving to death or whatever. And I think the universities are just afraid. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way I read it from the people who are seriously into this topic. And maybe they're wrong, but
can't
go
speak
ahead.
for universities. I can't speak for universities, but I can speak for commercial laboratories. And commercial laboratories just you pays your money, you get your answers, and they're either good or bad. And obviously, between Doc and I, we can determine if things are radioactive or not, and pre-screen samples. I don't know. It's
Well,
just a
I
thought.
think we might want to get on to the next topic, though, and this is perhaps a little bit more controversial, but my gut tells me that radiation leaking is basically policy of a lot of the elite now. And perhaps you can just say it's a subset of environmental degradation. They want problems. They want, that 500-mile piece of junk in the Pacific. They want all kinds of leaks in the Gulf of Mexico. At least that's my reading of it. I may be wrong. Any thoughts on that, Doc?
With respect to intentional depopulation efforts?
Well, I
Is that
think
what you
that's
mean?
one. I think that's one reason. I think they also want to create a crisis because they profit from crises dramatically. They can get control. They can get a regulatory agency. They can get a lot of benefits for them.
Oh, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but that's certainly a causative factor in a lot of warfare. And crisis invariably provides a mechanism to give more control to the powers that be. I don't think there's any question of that. I don't know that they have to intentionally precipitate a specific crisis. I think that as a matter of course, they simply maximize their return on any given crisis. As to whether or not they intentionally caused them, I don't think I'm in a position to say. But I would agree with you that the system is designed to concentrate power, and that every extant crisis is used to that end.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I will say that with Fukushima, that if you look at the seismographs, they don't look normal to me, the PNS waves, and they have really covered it up in Japan. They don't want to show them. They used to put these kinds of things in all the TV programs and newspapers, and then they just there hasn't been a single one shown in the whole country in the last few years. So it does raise questions if things couldn't be accelerated or controlled or whatever, but it's totally speculative.
Well, that ties into our earlier observation about the EPA shutting down their radiation monitoring stations. And a lot of the ones that remained in operation are now providing gross gamma counts, but they've eliminated their beta counts. And that's very suspicious to me, because beta counts probably are more indicative to the average layman regarding any sort of fuel leaks from Fukushima.
Agreed.
Well, anyway, I'm just going to say that the Japanese people are mystified by the response.
I think they should be outraged, not mystified.
I think they should be outraged too, Doc.
And I mean, you just look at it, and anyway, you just have to ask questions. I mean, for example, I knew a guy who was a Soviet nuclear officer, and he said that he and his colleagues in the nuclear corps there were all totally convinced that Chernobyl was an inside job. It was blown up as part of the takedown of the Soviet Union, the privatization, collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I don't know, but I have known this guy enough to say that he's normally a reasonably rational guy. Now, by American standards, all Russians are tremendous conspiracy theorists. So you can take that and just ignore it if you will. But it does raise the question. I mean, these are incredibly important geostrategic issues here. This Fukushima is a tremendous issue. As we talked about, if the Tokyo real estate market goes down, well, that means the whole Japanese banking system goes down and the currency goes down.
Agreed.
That's such
explained earlier,
such a tremendous event that you ought to keep that in mind. I'm sorry?
As I explained earlier, I think that it's very much a component of the way this is being managed. I think that's a critical component to the management of the whole Fukushima debacle, is financial. The interests of the powers that be and the international banking system. It's at grave risk because of the, no pun intended, fallout from Fukushima.
Well, they say about Chernobyl, the biggest damage was all the lies, right? And I think with Fukushima, maybe the biggest damage will be all of the economic impact over time.
Over time.
Well, again, 10, 20 years. Changing gears a little bit, do you have any thoughts on things they ought to do, or more speculative stuff. For example, I know that I think it's the University of Missouri, there's a professor there, Judy Wall, who's been working with a bacteria that essentially converts nasty uranium into more natural, whatever, uranite. Any thoughts on that kind of thing? Helium, are you aware of this stuff?
Haven't seen that one yet, and I don't really. There's all sorts of ideas and thoughts on how to cask and do away with the waste from nuclear reactors. I don't know of any that work yet. I'm sorry. I just don't know of anything that works yet.
Okay, got a question for you. When Fukushima first happened, let's say a week or two in, what did you expect them to do, and what have they done in terms of things like boron and other things?
Well, they couldn't have thrown boron directly on them, as in Chernobyl. Chernobyl was a graphite moderated reactor again, which you could, it was open air reactor. You could throw boron on it. The Fukushima was a boiling water reactor. The core was isolated by the steel encasement of the boiling water reactor. So just throwing boron on it was not going to necessarily cool the reactor until the corium burned through the bottom. Then they could put the boron on it and try and stop it at that point. But initially, we thought that it was not going to burn through the bottom. So we didn't expect a burn through of the bottom in the first couple of days. I think that once we had the hydrogen explosions, they should have known that we had the problems, and they should have probably been injecting boron water at that point in time, but they didn't want to deal with the tremendous amount of radiated water, which they're now. I saw some pictures today where it's almost as much as that reactor in Omaha or Nebraska, where they've got tremendous amounts of water. It's unbelievable the amount of water they've got stored that's just deadly radioactive, and it's going to have to be stored for a long time.
Blaine, it's also important to understand that some of these measures, like pouring boron or borated water onto nuclear materials, doesn't make them any less radioactive. The only thing that does is moderate, or in some cases stop, additional fission from occurring. And to that degree, it will stop additional radioactivity from being created. But for instance, if you have a block of cobalt-60 or some other radioactive material and pour boron on it, it has absolutely no effect on mitigating the radiation. Some of these proposed solutions aren't really solutions, or at least not very good ones.
Right. And as I said, that until the corium was actually stuck its nose out below the bottom of the reactor, sticking boron on it didn't do any good. Unlike the Chernobyl reactor. The Chernobyl reactor was open air in the very beginning. So two very different reactor problems. And
what would have happened if they had just piled, 1 million tons of dirt on them?
Well, Chernobyl, it would have helped, but in Fukushima had the reactor basically the
melt proof.
Well, no, but they had the whole core area, the whole boiling water infrastructure above it, protecting it. So if you tried to cover it up, you'd just be covering it up. You wouldn't be trying to do anything to reduce the infrastructure inside the reactor from destroying itself and having the cooling rods not interfering with each other and the cooling not getting in there. So just pouring dirt on top of it didn't work because it didn't get at the reactor, because the reactor itself was protected by the boiling water reactor containment vessel. And so not only the containment vessel, but the containment of the boiling water reactor itself. So it just didn't work. It is a whole different problem. Chernobyl and Fukushima are two different problems.
You might think of the reactor vessel and the containment structure as being like a pot on your stove, to draw a very simple analogy. If you had a fire in the pot and it was spewing out noxious fumes and concurrently burning a hole in the bottom of the pot, you could pour all the sand you wanted to over the pot and it might stop some of the fumes from going into your kitchen, but all the stuff would be leaking out of the bottom of the pot in any case, and the sand wouldn't stop that. And that's sort of what we've got at Fukushima. You've had melt down and melt through. The corium now is below the reactor vessel and below the containment structure, and it's into the earth. So if you poured concrete or sand on top of it, you're still really not doing anything to mitigate that groundwater flow through the corium and into the ocean. If anything, you might make it more difficult to do further remediation in the future because you've dumped all this stuff on top of it.
Absolutely. And whereas in Chernobyl had a graphite moderated reactor where all of the graphite the reactor was up in the air and exposed to the air, and you could just go ahead and throw sand and stuff on the top of it and cool it off and moderate it, and you could throw borated water and things like that up on the tops of the reactor. It was again like Windscale. Windscale was a graphite moderated reactor. Very different situation between the two problems. Very, very different problems.
So Helium, let me think here for a second. So if we were to ask what were the lessons to be drawn from this, I mean, is the answer that this design simply shouldn't be used and you shouldn't use it in a place with the kind of earthquakes that Japan has? What is the lesson?
No, the lesson is you should not use this. It was designed, the reactor got through the earthquake okay, but what it didn't get by is the backup generator that kept the cooling going was up on the 4th story, and the tsunami went up to the 5th story and killed the backup electricals that kept the cooling going. And so what happened is once the cooling dropped by, the core overheated and began the meltdown process. And so it was basically they didn't design for the worst case scenario. Plain and simple.
So you're saying that it was the tsunami that did it?
That was the basic problem, is the tsunami after the earthquake. The earthquake, they're okay, but the tsunami took out the backup generators, and that knocked them off the line.
Well, I thought they went back and forth on which lie to use in terms of whether it was the earthquake or the tsunami. So I don't know which one they're currently saying. But so what if in the U.S., let's say the new Madrid fault had another, 8.0 earthquake, which we could guess it had 200 years ago or something. What would happen then? I mean, there are similar designs all over the U.S., right?
Well, it all depends on where you're on the fault line, because as I learned from the Loma Prieta fault, when I was in my house, my wife felt the Loma Prieta very strongly, and I was walking out in front of the house and I didn't feel anything. When I was driving back up to my apartment, there was a huge fault in the freeway that was jagged lines, and I had to drive my car up over some sand ramps that were put there for me to drive my car over. So if you're right on the fault, you're going to be toast no matter what. But if you're a little further away, you probably are not going to experience that bad a damage. So if you're in the wrong place, I'm sorry, you're just toast.
Well, sure, but I mean, it just raises the question. I mean, for example, along the Atlantic Ocean, how many nuclear plants are there if a tsunami came in or a displacement wave from something?
Well, the number of places that are hit are, it's the luck of the draw. We've had tsunamis here in San Francisco where they come up and they're 6 inches high. They're not very big. On the East Coast, they're not particularly built for tsunamis because you need a long, sloping, inward bound shoreline, which the East Coast does not lend itself well to tsunamis. So I don't think that's a big problem on those. I've been in the New Hampshire plants, and they're not particularly really worrisome as far as tsunamis, but they're, who knows if there's going to be an earthquake. But they're not really where earthquake country is. Everything is a question of the damage, worst possible problem. And obviously, Fukushima exhibited something far outside the parameters that were designed for, just like 9/11, the towers were outside the parameter they were designed for. And if
well, they were designed for 757s or whatever. They were designed for that, but that's a different question.
Touche. We can disagree on that, but
well, I actually, a friend of mine, not long after 9/11, got to talk to one of the architects of the towers. And the guy was in shock and didn't know what happened. He had no explanation because they thought planes should have just bounced off, except, maybe the engine's getting stuck or whatever. But that's a whole nother topic. But
that's a whole nother topic. That's a whole nother topic.
And we can agree to disagree on what may have happened at 9/11. But nonetheless, I mean, there is talk of things like the Canary Islands, slipping eventually, and then so you would have some massive wave coming in. I don't know how high, but certainly 100 feet or something, whatever, maybe more, a couple hundred feet.
Exactly.
And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that if you're of an engineering mindset, these things are supposed to be designed to handle, there's got to be some balance. I mean, if a bridge collapses and 10 people get killed and it happens in the country once every few years, that's really just acceptable. That's just the way it goes. Things happen.
No,
right?
That's not acceptable.
It's not acceptable, but the point is, from a realistic point of view, we don't live in a perfect world. Now,
right.
I'm from an engineering background, so you understand. I'm not trying to say this is good. I'm just saying that you learn from your mistakes. How did that happen? And then you try to prevent that particular crash, just like with airplane crashes, they analyze what happened or something, right?
Right.
But in the real world, you don't have unlimited money for safety. You can't just make everybody drive a tank instead of a car, that kind of thing. And so with these, though, with the Fukushima question or Chernobyl, you're starting to talk about unacceptable losses, really.
That's right. And
what I'm trying to say also is let's get into the economics of this a little bit. I have listened, I forget his name now, but there was a guy who worked in nuclear physics, and then he quit and got either an MBA or an economics degree, and he's worked for, like economic forecasting companies. And I watched a debate of his on TV, and he strongly argued, and I thought had a good case, that nuclear energy was very economically, mediocre, that it was actually a losing deal. It was more a political military power question for the countries involved. And that might be something that Doc would have more of an idea. I don't know. Doc, have you looked into this? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do actually. And I would start by saying with Fukushima, you are potentially looking at the loss of a country. So how do you reconcile those economics on any scale? But further, when people talk about the economics of nuclear power, and they talk about the lack of greenhouse emissions and the other supposed savings, rarely do those equations take into account everything involved in the nuclear fuel cycle, from the mining, the processing, the enrichment. When you add all of those things into the equation, suddenly nuclear power doesn't look that attractive from an economic standpoint. And nuclear power has never been a standalone moneymaker. I mean, to this day, insurance companies refuse to underwrite nuclear power plants. And that's why, at least in the United States, there had to be special congressional approval for effectively the government to underwrite the risks, because the actuaries in the insurance industry wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
That's right.
Yeah, and also, I mean, let's take in Japan. Recently, the exchange rate changed and things got cheaper, but until recently, the Tokyo area had something like electricity rates 3 times that of, say, Seoul, Korea. So, of course, they can't compete with, electronics, anymore and things like that, is because the quality of life, the cost of living is so high. And here they are with all these nuclear plants, but they're not getting cheap electricity. They're getting expensive electricity.
Correct.
So you have to ask yourself, I mean, the logic behind this, that they sell it, is not necessarily what you observe in reality. So have you got any thoughts on that?
Helium?
Not at the moment.
Well, anyway,
I would agree. I mean, some countries like Japan, and there are others, Taiwan comes to mind, various other countries, they're not blessed with abundant fossil fuel resources. So as a matter of independence, on that basis alone, nuclear power has looked attractive. But it's like many other things that look attractive until the piper has to be paid. Right now, Japan is paying the piper in the form of Fukushima. Has it been that much of a bargain for the country?
Well, I think the issue is that the country isn't really independent. I mean, it's been under American occupation and quasi-control for a long time, so they really haven't had all the options that they wanted. And so with their limited range of options, nuclear was something that maybe they felt was the best in a bad situation. I mean, they have a great deal of geothermal resources. They could go after. Northern Japan is one of the windiest places on Earth. And then there's massive amount of methane hydrate in the ocean not far offshore, and they are finally starting to evaluate whether that's worth grabbing. But be that as it may, I mean, you can see, for example, they haven't built the pipelines to Russia, things like that they could easily have done or should have done, but I think it's American pressure that's prevented them.
Quite likely.
But setting all that aside, I'm just saying still, though, the point is, with a relatively large nuclear program, the electricity rates have been very, very high. It's not like it's been a winning deal, is all I'm trying to say.
Right.
And I don't know how that looks in the U.S., but I also know that they keep these things longer than they say they were going to. So, Helium, can you answer that? How long are these things? I mean, when they say the plant's supposed to last 35 years,
That's a pretty short lifetime, unfortunately, because of the buildup and the build down. There's no basic build down out of these plants. The decommissioning cycle is just atrocious. And if you only get 35 years out of them, coal plants have long, long lifetimes comparison to the nuclear plants. And I just don't see how these can ever be economical by any shake of the stick. They try to have them go on for longer times, but the trouble is you get neutron embrittlement of the first wall and things like that, where after a while the plant just doesn't work the way a coal-fired plant does work, and you can't go in there and just retool it the same way you can a coal plant. So it doesn't make sense economically to me to build these plants. And I'm a pro-nuke guy.
Well, that
earlier
raises...
we
Yeah, go
talked
ahead.
about Fermi 1, the Fermi 1 meltdown that occurred just outside of Detroit. That occurred in 1966, and the plant was decommissioned in 1972. It was given up as a hopeless cause. Now, I think it's instructive to point out that the decommissioning of Fermi 1 has not even really begun. Now, there's still so much toxic waste and so much hot material that Fermi 1 is still, quote unquote, in the process of being decommissioned. And all of these plants generate toxic waste that will be around literally for millions of years. I was reading today, just totally unrelated, but some material about Pompeii and Herculaneum, the Roman towns that were buried in volcanic ash. And that was approximately, 1700, 1800 years ago. And the archaeologists are still trying to divine the secrets of these towns. How do we expect future generations to understand where we put all our poison 200,000 years down the road? It's a legacy we're leaving future generations, which is really unconscionable and also has an economic component.
Well, now we get back to this question of whether this is more or less intentional. I mean, I find it hard to believe you can leave something sitting somewhere 40 years and it's just because, they didn't get around to it. I mean, it seems to me that the policy is to not decide. Right? In other words, it's to stay there forever.
As an economic expedient, it's always easier to kick
but
the
also
can
as a
down the road.
test. I think they also want to know how many people will get cancer and that kind of thing. That's useful from their point of view. So I think we're all guinea pigs. And if anybody doubts it, I think they're just not being realistic. The government has admitted to countless times spraying nasty stuff in subways here and there or whatever. Or, putting nasty things in vaccines for soldiers, stuff like that. And they just say, hey, the ends justify the means.
Absolutely.
And they're not really even denying it. I mean, they deny what they're doing today. But once it happened a long time ago, like the Tuskegee, syphilis cases or something, they'll just say, yeah, well, we killed 100 people we wanted to. I'm sorry, did you say something?
No, I'm clean.
Oh, okay. The connection was a little funky there. But anyway, so I think there's a case that they want radiation all over the place, and they want to do it with food. They want to radiate food to make it so you can prevent spoiling, right? I mean, so I think they really want us good and radiated. I mean, it certainly looks like they're doing so little in the case of Fukushima, not just the Japanese government, but the American government. I'm just... It's hard not to come to that conclusion. And, with the military, we don't know. They've probably lost a number of nuclear submarines and other things, and we don't know if they've tried to pick them up or not. But it just certainly looks like they're not trying very hard. And so then I guess I would say, if you're going to spend all this money on nuclear, wouldn't it make sense to have a crash program to find ways to decommission things? Like earlier I mentioned this professor working on bacteria that convert the kind of uranium. I mean, it's a safe bet that her budget is pathetically low.
Yes,
right?
True.
Right. If you spend any time in academia, you know that like the chemical equipment is partly that you got from your local liquor store or whatever, right? I mean, the glass bottles and things like that. So you have to say, why aren't they doing more? Couldn't they do more? Couldn't that, I've seen speculative tests of things like where they use UV on radioactive material and it makes it dramatically weaker, less radioactive, things like that. And, why aren't we seeing more of that? And also, Helium, are you aware of any of these experimental things? Any idea?
No, I've not heard anything about putting UV on things to make it less radioactive, but I was involved with one very strange experiment, having it put in high voltage fields to make it less or whatever radioactive, and the results were inconclusive.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, it's not that we have any answers here. I'm just saying it looks like they're hardly even trying, to be honest.
Helium, I think you would agree with me that at this point, this state of the art of the technology, there is no really practical or economical way to transmute nuclear materials into less hazardous elements.
Agreed. I don't know of anything other than the normal daughter products that come from fissile materials. And they typically the daughter products are pretty reactive at this point.
Well, what do you think going forward? What do you expect 10 years from now from this?
I think human nature will do what human nature always does, and that's remain the same. You had asked earlier, we had discussed the phenomenon of kicking the can down the road as an economic expedient. There's a medical physicist named John Goffman, who was one of the pioneers involved in the Manhattan Project, and he later became a thorn in the side of the old Atomic Energy Commission because he did a lot of research on low-level radiation and its hazards. So eventually they tried to sabotage Goffman's career. And one of the AEC people came to one of his colleagues and said, I'm going to quote from his book, quote, by the time these people get the cancer and leukemia, you'll be retired and I'll be retired. So what the hell difference does it make right now? We need our nuclear power program, and unless we destroy Goffman and Tamplin, the nuclear power program is in real hazard from what they say. And I think that's a very common attitude.
Agreed.
Well, that describes the entire military-industrial complex, doesn't it?
To one degree or another, yes.
I mean, they let off nukes in the high atmosphere, right?
Well, those did EMPs more than anything else. And there were only a few of those. Starfish was the pretty much point device for that particular set of tests.
That was the Starfish Prime test.
You're right.
Over to the Pacific, and that's where the public really got its first taste of EMP effects, because it knocked out a lot of the rudimentary electronics, civilian electronics that were in Hawaii at the time.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think, didn't the Soviets respond with one or something, and then they agreed to stop? Is that how it played out? Anyway, though, the point isn't. The point is simply, and I say this as a technical person, by the way. The mission is everything. You just play with stuff until you can't. And you don't really think that much about the long-term effects, like, damaging the, the atmosphere. That's just not in your list of concerns when you're doing it. And that's a big problem. I guess it's worth
mentioning. You mentioned EMP effects. Just one thing I'd like to bring up. You mentioned EMP effects. And you understand that virtually all of the power-producing reactors rely on grid power to cool themselves. And that's really what happened at Fukushima. You had a loss of coolant. It could be described as a loss of coolant accident,
right,
precipitated by loss of power, okay? Now, if we have a man-made EMP or we have a solar Carrington event, I predict you'll have scores of reactors melt down because they'll lose their grid power.
Yeah, so this is starting to sound like Matt Stein's work on, how fragile the system is, the grid in particular. And are you familiar with his work?
No, I'm not.
So he's an MIT engineer who just felt he got essentially the message, so to speak. He just felt like, this is such an issue. And he spent, he quit his job or whatever and spent 5 years writing a couple of books and researching how civilization could go down the drain based on its fragility. And the grid is the obvious one. Things like nuclear plants, but everything really, hospitals, you name it, petroleum refineries, everything now is basically high tech and not very solid. And what you're describing is just very similar. I mean, how can we not be ready for a Carrington event? We had one 150 years ago. We know they happen. It's logical they'll happen again. And it just makes no sense that these nuclear plants are so unprepared. And are you aware of Greg Pallas' story? Doc, you're in the journalism world, right? So
Yes, I've heard. I'm vaguely familiar with Greg Pallas.
Okay, so he's a fairly famous investigative journalist for the BBC, and he's had some best-selling books. But originally, he was for the U.S. government. He worked as I guess what you would say, a fraud investigator, prosecutor, and that's how he got into his position on TV. And his conclusion with Fukushima, from the very beginning, is he said, "Look, this is like." I forget if it was one of the nuclear plants he'd helped prosecute in New York, where they paid something like a $100 million fine. He said, look, none of these places have actual backup generator systems that work because it would be too expensive. So they just get like a decommissioned thing from the Queen Elizabeth boat or something, right? And in other words, they just pretend to do it. Mm-hmm. And that all of their fail-safe systems, backups, all this stuff is all fake. It won't actually work in the real world if something goes wrong. So
I think that's true. And
so to whatever degree the earthquake did this or the tsunami did that, in a sense, the real issue is that they actually don't even have what they say they do. They're not
Correct.
really ready. Let's say that the tsunami had only gone, had been 10 feet lower in height. You still would have had the problem that they don't have when they say it's good for X amount of time and X amount of this, it's really not very believable, at least not to Greg Pallas. And again, that's kind of his career of sorts. And so that makes sense to me. So I think we have a very fragile system. And that's why I was asking a while ago about like the Atlantic Ocean is I know there aren't that many recorded tsunamis on the Atlantic Ocean, but I'm just saying I still just don't have faith. And anyway, if in the future the U.S. ever gets involved in a war, I mean, can't you just create a tsunami with a bomb under the ocean? The U.S. was just about ready to use it against Japan in World War II because they did all kinds of tsunami bomb research off the coast of New Zealand. And the reason they say now they've declassified the documents, and they say the reason they didn't use it against Japan is because they had the atom bomb instead, and they preferred to use the atom bomb. But I'm just saying, if the U.S. government had tsunami bombs in 1945, then isn't it reasonable to think that the Chinese or Russians or whoever would have something far, far better today, just ready to go?
Absolutely.
And if that's sitting there ready to go, then I would say you need to have a better, more robust grid than what we seem to have.
Well, speaking of Carrington events and EMPs, you had talked about the phenomena of unnecessary complexity. And I would like to address the diesel backup question regarding Carrington events and EMPs. Diesel engines are inherently very simple machines. I have one outside that has no electronics whatsoever, and I hand crank it to start it. However, many of these nuclear power plants, though they're equipped with diesels, have encumbered them with electronic controls which are not hardened against EMPs and Carrington events. So you could have a perfectly viable, workable diesel that, when it's needed in the event of an EMP or Carrington event, cannot operate because the electronic controls are fried. And that's an example of unnecessary or built-in complexity in our systems, which are points of vulnerability. And helium can probably speak to that more comprehensively than I can.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but I must say that the ability to power a nuke just for cooling does not require anything more than simple diesel powered devices, and you can probably rewire those. What I got from this discussion this evening is that perhaps the wiring of the plants are not as thoughtful as they might be to get into just the basic cooling and running my own power backup. If you don't have your power backup into just your really necessary cooling devices, cooling whatever it is, you're trying to run your computers, you're trying to run your other things like this, you can kill your system. And as you say, it just won't work properly.
Well, I think Palace was arguing that they just don't want to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars it would take to have robust backup generators that they think they're not going to use, and that paying a fine every year of $5,000 or $50,000 or whatever is just a cost of doing business as far as they're concerned, versus the cost of actually making a robust system.
Well, the thing is, if you have a robust system, if you're trying to power things that the EMP will blow out anyway, you're not in as good a shape as if you have a system which is all motors and generators and things like that that are all AC coupled, and that will survive the EMP because it's EMP stable. But if you're trying to run electronics and things like that, they will not survive the EMP. But the motors and generators and cooling pumps will. That makes sense.
Well, I think the big problem is just the economics. I think that the people running these things, utilities and other, they're just used to the idea that you just pay a certain amount in fines. It's like banks, they money launder $100 billion, and fine, you pay $1 million fine. Who cares?
No, but they want to have the SCADA working. But the SCADA is not what they want working. They want the just bare bones wires and magnets and pumps working. They want switches. I've gone back. I've built computerized systems for accelerators, and I've went back, replaced everything with switches and just motors. And anytime you just have switches and motors, it's way better, because otherwise sparks and things like this are going to knock everything out.
For sure.
Helium, do you remember the 1974 Browns Ferry accident in Alabama?
Yes, I do.
Now, I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with that, but Browns Ferry nuclear power plant in Alabama had an almost catastrophic accident back, I believe it was 1974, with multiple reactors. And the accident was a fire. It occurred in a conduit tunnel. So they wound up with a situation where they had perfectly operable reactors, perfectly operable backup systems, but the fire occurred at a wiring nexus point that threw everything offline. And they almost melted down two of those reactors because they couldn't control anything. And that goes back to your observation about the increasing complexity of our systems. A stupid little fire almost made Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, if not larger area, uninhabitable.
Well, I think this is just ridiculous, to be honest. We shouldn't have such dangerous things that are so fragile. But I think that's one of the bigger issues with the whole Fukushima question is just at the highest level, a system that's too old, wasn't designed well to begin with, and it's in like a place with the strongest earthquakes and tsunamis in the world. Is that a rational? I mean, who came up with that bright idea? So anyway, let's wrap it up soon. Any other Disaster Cat? Have you got any questions?
No, I think that about wraps it up. I think it's been really, really interesting, and I've just been fascinated listening.
Well, is Ireland safe?
Actually, that's a good. Well, that was kind of when I asked the question about was it going to affect just the Pacific or could it eventually affect everywhere? I was asking sort of in terms of the ocean, but I guess in terms of fallout and everything, I mean, I would think that most of our direct threat would be like from food supply and imported foods and things. But is there anything else that we would need to worry about in say Europe and Northern Europe from this?
I could add this. We've been discussing Fukushima in static terms, the situation as it is today, which is very, very bad. Yet the potential exists for Fukushima to become exponentially worse. We can't assume that it will remain static and only be what it is, bad as that is. There are any number of things that can occur at Fukushima, especially regarding the spent fuel pools, that could make that accident almost an extinction level event.
Like what? Blow up?
Basically, burn up. The compromised fuel pools, especially the one at reactor number 4, they're having a lot of difficulty with. They're not entirely sure how to remove the broken and damaged fuel rods from that pool. That could cause accidental additional criticalities. That could cause voluminous amounts of fission products to be ejected into the atmosphere. If that occurred, that entire plant and the immediate area would have to be evacuated. So no workers could even remain on site to affect future remediation efforts.
Agreed.
So okay, then that kind of raises the question, why have they left that fuel pool 4 there? Why haven't they moved it?
They
Same
can't
reason
get
they
out.
haven't taken the Corium out. They don't know how to do it yet.
They've never moved a fuel pool?
Not at 4 stories up.
Not damaged, not when the racks have been compromised, and not when the rods themselves have been broken and twisted, and some of them laying on the bottom of the structure. No, that's never been attempted before in human history.
And remember, it's 4 stories up.
Well, sure, but I mean, don't you drill everything? I mean, isn't that like how you would do it? I mean, if you ever go to, you go to a Navy boat that deals with things, they have all these drills. Here's what you do for this, here's what you do for that. And you're saying that of course it's 4 stories up. That's where they put it, right? I mean, that they can't just freeze it? What I'm trying to say is they can't put it in something that'll keep it cold and move it to another existing fuel pool, 100 miles away.
We're talking about tons of material.
Yeah, but I mean, what if you do it one at a time? How much,
No, they can't get at it one at a time because there's debris all over the top of it. They have to move out of the way to get to the pool.
And Plain, it's not so much of a thermal question. You talked about the prospect of freezing it. When you were a child, do you remember that little game they used to sell to kids probably back in the 1960s? It was called Operation, and you had a pair of electrified tweezers, and you had to remove all of the organs from the body on the game board. But if you touched the side of it, the buzzer would go off, and you lost the game. It was a little child's game, okay?
I remember that.
That's kind of the situation they have with those damaged fuel pools. If one of those broken rods, now remember, when they put the spent fuel pools in the the spent fuel rods in the fuel pool, they are still fissile. They are still capable of chain reactions. So they put them in very geometrically precise racks. And then they put that carefully in the water. The earthquake damaged those racks and damaged some of the pools, damaged some of the rods, and then, to add insult to injury, dumped debris on top of it all and destroyed the crane mechanism that they used to remove and place the rods. So now think of that little game operation. When they go to carefully remove all of this, if the wrong rod hits another rod or comes too closely adjacent to it, you can get instant criticality or super criticality, neutron beams, additional meltdown, fire, and possibly even explosion. And if that happens, like I said earlier, they've got to evacuate that entire plant. That could morph into something that is yet even more uncontrollable and much, much worse than what we've experienced to date. Now, helium is the expert. Am I wrong?
Yeah, and now remember, if it's just two rods, then you can have an event just like that one in remember, what was that one where we had Tukamura? Just two rods could do Tukamura. And if you remember, you've got how many 100 rods here in this thing? So if you get a bunch of them going, this could be a very, very bad situation.
Well, then that begs the question, because I was under the impression that whole area was subsiding and that essentially the land was sinking, and so they were really having to hold it up with kind of like duct tape, so to speak.
Exactly.
Now, if that's the case, though, that's a limited thing. Eventually, it might be 5 years, but at some point, the center of gravity could shift to the point where it really, is not very manageable at all, and things could start rolling around or whatever, and then you could start have massive criticalities to the point where they could no longer go in and put more duct tape.
Plain another substantial earthquake could do that as well.
Yeah, of course. A major earthquake over whatever, a 7 or something like that. Actually, the land is so lousy, I don't even think they need a 7. It's just a question of how close it is. But let's see. We'll wrap it up. Disaster Cat, any last comments, questions?
No, like I said, it was really, really interesting, and maybe some other time when we have more time, some of the things that I wondered about, but I didn't know quite when to interject with them, were for lay people, like what exactly does meltdown mean, and questions like that. But I think they're more technical, and it's probably getting kind of late.
Well, let's do that next time. We'll have another show at some point, because there's a lot with radiation, not just Fukushima. There are some other thoughts, but I think it's getting a little late here. So why don't we wrap it up? And Helium and Doc, I want to thank you very much for coming, and Disaster Cat, you too. And that's it for this edition. Thanks, folks.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.